Today is a special episode. Today, we are delving into a man revered as a god amongst men. The father of our country, George Washington. How did a man from Virginia achieve such a status? How did he ascend to the highest office in the newly formed United States, only to give up that power, setting a precedent that has remained the status quo for 250 years? Joining us to find out how is Richard Lim. Richard is the host of This American President podcast, which will be linked in the description, and is the author of a book about the man himself titled Refusing a Crown. Enjoy the episode. Richard, welcome to American History Gazette.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Now, this is a very special episode to me because George Washington is a man that I greatly admire and greatly respect, and I most definitely view him as the father of our country, as most people do. But today we're just focusing on his presidency. And before we can understand how he ascended to the presidency, we have to understand the position he was in at the conclusion of the American Revolution and the subsequent Constitutional Convention, which set the framework for this brand new nation, this unprecedented experiment. So how did the nation view Washington at this point? And how did his victory against the British kind of set the stage for him to step into office?
Yeah, that's a great question. One historian basically said that when Washington took office, he was in the equivalent of political heaven. He was unanimously chosen as the commander of the Continental Army at the start of the Revolutionary War. He was unanimously chosen as the president of the Constitutional Convention, and he was unanimously chosen twice as president. So he's about as universally beloved as any figure in any country. And this is even more remarkable when you consider the fact that all of the states at the time were like different countries in many ways. Baltimore had a very different history than Massachusetts. Pennsylvania was filled with Quakers. The South had Episcopalians. The Puritans were up in the North. I mean, these are people that didn't necessarily have the same exact worldview. The New England merchants were not much like the Southern landowners. And yet all of them could agree on one thing, that they needed George Washington as president. And so the reason why they loved him so much wasn't necessarily just because he won the war. It was because of the way he conducted himself during the war. They knew he was a man of character. That's one thing. The fact that he was wealthy, but unlike a lot of wealthy people, he wasn't hedging to see who was going to win the war. He said right from the outset, my fortunes are tied to this cause. And this is before America jumped into the war. This is when they're still protesting. But he said right from the start, if the British take over and it becomes a tyranny, then I'm done, and then he took on the reins as the commander, and he would have been the first man hung in the Tower of London had the war not gone his way. So there was that, the fact that he put his money where his mouth was, so people trusted him. But the other thing was that the way he conducted himself as commander-in-chief is really unprecedented in history, because he's fighting to create a republic. And so, unlike most commanders, Louis let's say Frederick the Great, who was the Prussian king, he had the luxury of being a king and centralizing the government and marshaling all the forces to win victories for him. Same thing went with Louis the 14th and all of his commanders. But Washington literally had to take a bunch of a loose confederation of states and turn them into a fighting force, a ragtag force. And he had to do it in a way that was consistent with Republican values, respecting the property of loyalists, fighting in a way that, first of all, his army, they had short-term enlistments. 1 year, and his soldiers, their enlistments would run up. And so literally he had a new army every single year, which is horrible for discipline. It's horrible for training. It's horrible for institutional knowledge. And so he had to do all of that, and he did it. And did it by and large by respecting civilian authority. Congress was a disaster because they had very little power, and just like all Congresses, they had myopic interests. The congressmen were doing more for their own states than for the country as a whole. And he had to fight all that. And somehow he did it all. And it literally, that was the only thing uniting the whole country. And so and it's interesting because his reputation was so high that becoming president and entering the civilian political world, it only was going to be downhill for him. It's kind of like, I love sports analogies, but, it's like when Michael Jordan, won 6 championships and he hit the game-winning shot at the end of his time with the Bulls. And a lot of people said, this is too perfect an ending. Don't come back, because coming back is only downhill. He came back anyways, but that's kind of the position Washington was in. He could only go downhill. And in a sense he did, because he made controversial decisions that pissed people off. But that's how he had that stature.
Yeah, it's absolutely remarkable what he was able to do with the Continental Army. You mentioned, it's just a ragtag group of basically farmers at the time who just got together. You're having a new army every year. You're fighting the biggest empire in the world at the time, and you still come out on top while maintaining those values that are aligned with, a democratic republic. It's just absolutely remarkable. And the way he carried himself, like you said, he was very stoic. He was rarely ever seen flustered. He was always leading his men from the front. He was always at the front lines in battle. His advisors and aides would always have to pull him off of the front lines so he wouldn't get injured. But you're right. At the time, it wasn't, I'm an American. It's, I'm a Virginian, I'm South Carolina, whatever. And it was absolutely unanimous, despite their cultural differences, despite their geographical differences. Basically, the only unanimous thing at the time in the country was that Washington is the guy. He's absolutely, bar none, the guy. But after the Constitutional Convention, they set the framework for this new presidency, and everyone basically says, Washington's our guy, let's put him in. But Washington didn't necessarily have an interest in politics or want the presidency, did he?
No, not at all. For the reason that I said earlier, that it would only go downhill. One of the remarkable things I also think people don't realize about Washington was that, so he had very clear opinions about what he felt the nation needed to do to survive. And he felt that the government under the Articles of Confederation were not, it was basically ineffective. And I think it's unfortunate the way the language, how the language has developed, because people like to say that Washington and his other Federalists, the ones that supported the ratification of the Constitution, wanted a strong central government. I think that's a misnomer. What they really wanted was an effective national government. When Washington was president, he respected the rights of the states. And he was somebody that respected the rights. As president, he had a very limited view of the president's job. The president did not get involved in legislation. He said that Congress was the first wheel that created the motion for the rest of the system. So he would actually sign laws he didn't even agree with. But his role wasn't to impute his own viewpoints. That was the purview of Congress and the people. In fact, he only vetoed. He viewed the veto as something that you used only if the law wasn't constitutional, but it wasn't the president, gets to decide domestic policy. The Congress did that, and that's desirable in the sense that if something affects the American people, their representatives should talk about it. It shouldn't be one guy just shoving it down everyone's throat. So he had a very limited view of the role of the national government, So it's not really he wanted a strong central government. It's that he wanted an effective, national government. He saw during the American Revolution that the country didn't marshal its forces effectively against its enemies, which led to a longer war at greater cost, more people dying. And so he felt that if the national government had enough power to basically get the country's finances in order, then you would have an effective country that could deter other countries and, if need be, win a war. That's why I think sometimes it's unfortunate that the language is turned into, the Federalists wanted a strong national government. In some ways, they wanted, by having an effective national government, they actually could limit bad policies by the states. So, for instance, states would often, because they were like countries, they would levy tariffs against each other. And so, there were states that were actually stuck between two states that levied heavy tariffs, so they'd be double tariffed. But an effective national government could actually clear the whole country to be a free trade zone. So in that sense, an effective national government would reduce the burden of government on in people in the states. So in a sense, sometimes an effective national government would actually reduce onerous government policies. So these were all of the things he was advocating for. And I wanted to make the point that, Washington had clear views about what he felt the country had to do to survive, but he never forced them on the American people. At the end of the war, he could have just said, I'm going to stay in power, and I really think we need to have a stronger government, so I will just become the generalissimo of the country, and you guys figure out the Constitution, or here's the Constitution. That's what other people have done. Even after his 2 terms as president, he could have done that. He definitely wanted John Adams over Jefferson, but he didn't even wade into that because that was something the people had to decide. And it was that constant reticence to use power. It wasn't just leaving power. It was when he was president, constantly being reticent to use it, having a very limited interpretation of the powers of the presidency. That's what caused people to trust him.
Which I also think is a testament to his character, because I think he could have easily done that after the revolution, where he's still the general, the commander-in-chief. He could have easily stepped into power and said, we need a strong leader, I'm the guy, and stepped in. But no, he gave up that power and then would do it again after his 2 terms. But it's a testament to his character that even a man as powerful as he was in the country and viewed as he was still willing to limit his power and give up his power because that's what was best for the country. And you mentioned how the Federalists, they wanted a strong government, but they wanted an effective government. I think that's especially important at that time because you're starting from nothing. You have to build the foundation and bring these states together as a nation. Are you the United States are, or are you the United States is? You know what I mean? People often say that comparison. Back then, you used to say the United States are because it was seen as all these separate states, but you have to have that strong government to bring the states together and to have that national, unity. But after the Constitutional Convention, the rules and guidelines for elections and the presidency was very different than what we see today. It was a lot more limited. It was a lot more lenient. It was a lot more gray area on what the president could do. There was a lot less, amendments and legislation limiting and saying what the president could not do. And the elections were also very different. So kind of walk me through how the rules and guidelines of the election of presidency were different than they are today.
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's interesting because, kids, when they're taught about the Electoral College, they're kind of taught this thing about how, you don't vote directly for president, you vote for members of the Electoral College for president. We have this Electoral College, and you got to win a majority, and every state, if you win a state, you get all its votes and all that stuff. And that's the system that has evolved into what we have today. And essentially, that system is such that no one consciously votes for a member of the Electoral College, right? You're still voting for, yes, you're voting for electors for a president, but you don't think about that. You just put who you want for president. It's like you're directly voting for a candidate for president, even though it's kind of filtered through the Electoral College. Well, the idea back then was that these members of the Electoral College were going to represent whoever voted for them in the same way that when you voted for a member of Congress, people didn't vote directly for laws. You voted for a member of Congress who would then vote for those laws, right? So that member of Congress has a little bit of agency there. you're voting for their judgment to choose somebody for president, and then that electoral college member would go on to cast their vote in the state legislature, and then all those votes would be aggregated at the federal level. And so it's a little different than Congress because they didn't want them all meeting together and having smoke-filled room bargains. They wanted them to be meeting in their states, and then the votes would be counted later. But the point is that just in the way that you vote for a member of Congress to vote for laws, you were voting for a member of the Electoral College to vote for president. And the idea was that, the founders wanted the people to rule, but they wanted that rule filtered, right? Because they knew that people were susceptible to demagogues, and they wanted them to, choose somebody that could then deliberate on the issue. We vote for members of Congress to handle these things because we don't have time to look at every single law, right? So that was the idea. And the other thing, too, was that the Constitution also grants a great deal of discretion. It basically leaves it up to the states to decide how members of the Electoral College would be chosen. Some of them would be chosen by popular vote. Some of them would be chosen by the state legislature, which was another filter because the people would vote for the state legislature, who would then vote for the Electoral College member, and so on and so forth. So different states voted, chose their electors differently. That was all up to the states. And so it was from that. So you can't really get like a clear popular vote on the first elections of George Washington, right? The first two. It wasn't really until the 1820s that you start seeing popular vote becoming something that was, tabulated uniformly across the country. So that in and of itself was different. But I'm sure if they left it up to a popular vote, Washington would have won by ridiculous margins as well. But yeah, and then as far as the powers of the presidency back then, I mean, you have to remember that the Constitution was a framework, and it's like if somebody gave you a rule book and say, here, turn this into something, flesh and blood, right? It's one thing, when the founders created the Constitution, they were creating a framework, and they didn't know exactly how it was going to work. There's such a difference between creating something and actually living that thing day to day. It's like when you look at a job on paper versus actually having the job. Or it's like when you look at a profile of someone on a dating app versus actually going on a date with them. A lot of people look great on paper. Doesn't mean that they're good, as far as being a boyfriend or girlfriend. So it's that kind of thing. And the founders knew that you needed experience to test out what worked and what didn't. So that's literally what it was given to George Washington and that first Congress. Hey, here, make this work. Here's your job description, Article 2 of the Constitution. Go, run, make it work. And so he had to really, he asked a lot of advice, but, everything down to what the title of the president should be, how he should greet people, just all those little questions he had to figure out. And he knew the stakes of what he was doing. He even said, there's a quote where he said, I walk on untrodden ground, and things that I do now will set important precedents later on, for better or for worse. So it was really a tricky situation.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting to note that back then, elections, the runner-up was actually the vice president. You didn't have this ticket with two guys running together on a campaign. The runner-up of the election was actually the vice president, which in this election would have been John Adams, which Washington was actually okay with. It's actually what he preferred. But it's crazy that this really was just an unprecedented experiment in world history. And you're right, it absolutely was a framework. And I just want to completely emphasize how crazy this was, because Washington stepped in with a framework and had to completely shape the presidency and this new government from nothing. It's not like we have all this structure and amendments today. It was just a completely new experiment. Everything he did set a precedent. Absolutely everything. So he had to completely just start from something new. And it's wild when you look at it from today, because he really just set everything. But anyway, one of the things he had to start that wasn't necessarily in the Constitution was a cabinet. So he's unanimously elected. The only time that's happened in history, aside from his re-election, when he's unanimously elected again. But he's unanimously elected, becomes president, is inaugurated, and then he has to appoint a cabinet. So who does he appoint to his cabinet, and what are the positions?
Yeah. So it's interesting because the cabinet, some of it originated in the kind of the foundation of what was laid during the era of the Articles of Confederation. When during the start of the American Revolution, there was very little in the way of actual governance, and there was no executive branch under the Articles of Confederation. So basically, committees on Congress would do that, and it was a disaster. And so basically, they appointed people to function as kind of a proto cabinet during that time, and Washington worked closely with them. So basically, John Jay was he was like the Minister of Foreign Affairs. That was kind of the pre-Secretary of State equivalent. And who was it? Robert Morris was the financier of the Revolution, and he was basically the Minister of Finance. And so there was some foundation for that. And the Constitution doesn't explicitly talk about a cabinet, but it does have a provision in it that basically says the president may require the opinion of the executive officers of the government. So it kind of acknowledged that there were these nebulous positions. There were these positions that were ad hoc, that were kind of, the heads of the executive departments. It wasn't like a clear acknowledgement of a cabinet. But yeah, basically Washington realized that he needed something like that. And his first choices, it's interesting because he wanted to keep John Jay, who was another prominent figure. He actually ended up getting the third most number of electoral votes in the first presidential election. It was Washington, Adams, and then Jay. And Jay had written some of the Federalist Papers, or at least had a hand in them. So he was a prominent figure. Washington ended up making him the first Chief Justice, but he wanted Jay to be Secretary of State because he had the experience. And Robert Morris, who he was very close with, wanted him to be Secretary of Treasury. But both men declined for whatever reason. Morris was probably done because he had a heck of a time being the Minister of Finance with no finances to minister to. Instead, the recommendation was given to him to make Hamilton the Treasury Secretary, and he knew Hamilton very well. Hamilton was his aide-de-camp, basically his chief of staff during the Revolution. He was this whiz kid, very controversial then and now, because he was somebody who unabashedly supported. I think of all the Federalists, if you had a spectrum of how strong the government was, which founder supported what. Hamilton would be on the end of a much stronger federal government, and then instead of Jay, he chose Thomas Jefferson, his fellow Virginian, landowner. And it's interesting because from those two men were absolutely brilliant men, and historians look at that cabinet and basically say this was it. This was the greatest cabinet in history, but it also was among the most contentious cabinets in history. And from that cabinet, the two parties developed. And so it's one of those things where, and later on, Washington basically has more of a across the board Federalist cabinet. But early on, I was talking to my wife about this. I thought if Jay and Morris would have been in this cabinet, they probably would have been, it probably would have been less rancorous. But would it have been as brilliant? Would Washington be getting as good advice? And Washington didn't always side with Hamilton. People think that he sided hook, line, and sinker with Hamilton. And the Jefferson and Madison basically said that Washington was Hamilton's tool. But he didn't always side with Hamilton. He actually rejected Hamilton's advice when it came to having very strong protectionist policies. He had mild protectionist policies, and he rejected Hamilton's advice when Hamilton said, "Don't recognize the French Revolution ambassador government," and he took Jefferson's advice. But yeah, it's one of those things, less rancor, but maybe less brilliance. And rounding out the cabinet, he chose a guy named Edmund Randolph as Attorney General, who was also another Virginia landowner, and they had worked together for a long time. And he also chose Henry Knox as Secretary of War, which is the equivalent of Secretary of Defense. And, we were talking earlier about ragtag in the Revolution. He really is an indication of that, because when the war started, just before the war started, Henry Knox was a bookseller. He was basically just a guy that owned a bookshop. And he rose to become, along with Nathaniel Greene, one of Washington's two top generals. Nathaniel Greene was a farm boy. So you literally have like a farm boy and a bookseller. And, these guys, there was no West Point at the time, right? So the way these guys trained to fight the most, dominant empire in the world was to just read books on it.
Yeah, and the cabinet here with Hamilton and Jefferson, you're absolutely right with the brilliance. I mean, these were some of the best thinkers in all of American history. I mean, you just look at the Declaration of Independence that Thomas Jefferson wrote. It's just magnificent. But it's definitely here where you really start to see that partisanship and those parties start to form, with the Federalists under Hamilton and the Democratic Republicans kind of coalescing around Jefferson. And there was a lot of infighting in that cabinet. I mean, they disagreed philosophically on basically every issue, and Washington had to mediate that and had to pick and choose what to agree with. He gets into office, he has his cabinet, and there's a lot that he has to deal with stepping into office. Obviously, you have a brand new nation that you have to set the foundation for. You have a foreign policy crisis brewing over with your former ally in the American Revolution, starting with the French Revolution. You have to develop trade ties and an alliance with the British, which you just fought. You have a border crisis, I guess you could call it, with the Native Americans and the encroaching settlers. So there's just a ton. You have an economic crisis with the debt you incurred from the American Revolution and all the state debt. And we'll get into that later with Hamilton's financial plan. But there's just so many crises that Washington has to deal with. And how does he deal? I mean, what is he thinking when he steps into office with all these concerns? What are kind of his main concerns when he steps into office? What's the first thing he addresses?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you have a situation that is just, I mean, there's so much uncertainty, it's interesting because if you look at the founding era, it looks so linear, right? You have this situation where, the British tax us, we get mad, protest, war, America, with the help of the French, win the war, create a constitution, create the presidency, new government. It just seems very linear. It's very neat, but that really belies the fact that a lot of it was just there's so much uncertainty, and there was fear that would the country even survive. They were creating, the first large-scale republic, right? Up until then, republics were like the Roman Republic. It was a city-state. But creating a large-scale republic, all of that was in theory. No one knew if that would actually work. A constitution is in theory until it actually gets, its precedents get set and traditions start. So part of it was just, okay, can this government hold together at all, period? Can there be elections? Will those elections really be free? Just the basic things that all of us take for granted. What's going to happen after the first president? How long will the first president be in office? Is he going to be in office for life? I mean, just all these basic questions that all of us, when political parties develop, can this republic survive political parties? Back then, when governments broke into factions, civil war was inevitable. So it was just everything was a question. We trust Washington now, but what if his successor is a dictator? I mean, just literally every single thing, how will the branches interact with each other? What will the Supreme Court do? I mean, all of this was just it was completely experimental. So you have that, and then you have the ever-present threat of European empires. You have the British, the French, and the Spanish empires that are right there, and so they're ready to pounce. Historically, we know that just a couple of decades later, the British and the United States go to war again in the War of 1812. So that was basically the British wanting its colonies back, and that was always hanging over the heads of the Americans. The debt crisis, I think, was the biggest initial crisis, because because what happened was that since the government had no real way to raise money for the American Revolution, it did it based on just giving IOUs to all these creditors. And to win the war, you needed to. It's interesting because there was this notion that people were going to fight just based on their love for the country, right? Well, what happened during the war was that most people stayed home, and it was actually a lot of the the poor who had no real other prospects, and they would fight. And no one wanted to pay them because they said if you do that, you turn this into a mercenary war, and we can't. Mercenary war is it's not really based on Republican values, right? So basically, these soldiers weren't paid, and there were all these IOUs given, and the country got into massive debt, and the IOUs became currency, but there was little belief that the currency would be paid, or the IOUs would be paid. So the currencies became worthless. And then people sold these soldiers. A lot of these soldiers who fought for free were given IOUs. And the currency, the IOUs, they ended up selling it at like 10% of the original value because they needed money quickly and there was no faith they would be sold. So you had all this worthless currency. And economic historians look back and they basically say that the country was the economic depression it experienced in the 1780s was the equivalent of the Great Depression, right? It was that bad. So that's the economic crisis Washington was dealing with. And Hamilton's plan was basically to consolidate all of the state debt and the federal debt. And the argument was that the states who, back then, a lot of the states, if a state didn't want to bear the burden of the war, it just said, you pay off your debt, and a lot of the states were complaining that Hamilton was, since his plan called for consolidating all the state debts and raising taxes, the states that had paid off their debt were complaining that, we're being penalized twice for this. But then Hamilton would argue, yeah, but a lot of the states that paid off the debt didn't incur the burden of the war, right? If you incurred a greater burden of the war, more of the battles were fought in these states than other states, then you benefited from that. And so you should pay your share in terms of winning the war. And so, his plan called for raising taxes in order to pay back the debt of the war. Otherwise, the debt was just going to sit there, and even worse, the United States credit would be in the toilet if it didn't pay back all its debts, right? And what people don't realize is that, yes, at that moment, people were complaining that it wasn't fair and people hate taxes and whatnot. But the fact that he created a mechanism to pay that debt was critical because it established our credit, which then allowed us to borrow money in the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, and the Civil War. And America probably wouldn't have been able to win wars without those things. So, basically that whole idea, which led to the Assumption Plan, and then Hamilton introduced the bank, proposed the bank. And it's interesting because, there are people that love the bank, there are people that hate the bank. It had a 20-year charter, which really indicates to you that it was something meant for its time. And then once it was no longer useful, they could get rid of it, which actually did happen. It was renewed, War of 1812. But the thing to know about the bank was that Washington signed it mainly in deference to Congress. He didn't sign it because he endorsed, crony capitalism, and they knew that there was going to be some level of corruption with the bank, but they felt that this was part of getting the country's finances in order. And so he signed it, and he mainly looked at the constitutionality of it. He asked Jefferson, and he asked Madison, and he asked Hamilton about its constitutionality. That's mainly what he was focused on.
Yeah, so he did ultimately support Hamilton's financial plan, and like you said, all he was focused on was constitutionality. He signs it in. But when he comes into office, they had a serious problem about raising money because they couldn't tax the citizens directly because that just would have been impractical since they had just fought a revolution because of taxes. So something I'd like to briefly get into that happened before Hamilton's financial plan and was an attempt to raise the money was the tariffs of 1789 and 1790, which imposed a tariff on British goods to help bring some money and stimulate, the money for the federal government, but also to stimulate industry in the colonies and help, American-made products and American industry and stuff like that. So what were the tariffs of 89 and 90, and what did they do to stimulate that economic growth that was needed?
Yeah, so the first tariff, literally the tariff of 1789, it was literally one of the very first laws. It's probably the first major law ever made in American history under the new Constitution. And Madison was the one who actually pushed it through, which is interesting because he later he identified with the Jeffersonian wing, but he was a supporter of the tariff. And the idea was just to get a revenue stream. I mean, when you have a bank, or I'm sorry, when you have all that debt, it was just, there was no money in the treasury at all. So that was part of it. There were definitely elements of having some protection because at the time the British were well into their revolution, their industrial revolution, which allowed them to create goods for very cheap. And the United States didn't have that yet, but it was being stunted by the fact that the British were flooding the world and the American market with very cheap goods, textile goods, and other forms of manufacturing. And the notion that, well, the idea, one of the ideas behind the tariff was that the United States, first of all, needed revenue. It also needed to protect certain industries that were specifically related to building material that could be used for weapons in the event that another war broke out, right? So some of it was you're stunting our industrial development that could allow us to protect ourselves. And it's interesting because Jefferson, the guy that opposed much of the proposals to strengthen the government at the time, ended up supporting tariffs as well for manufacturers. He said that during his presidency, even though he wasn't thrilled with it initially, but he actually said, yeah, we have to do this for national security reasons. So it was actually relatively bipartisan, something that Washington, Hamilton, and Jefferson all agreed upon eventually. The other thing, too, that's important to know about the tariff, so what it did was that it imposed 50 cents per ton on foreign goods and at about 6 cents per ton on American goods. Now, the interesting thing to note about this, we don't use tariffs anymore for federal revenue. We use income tax, largely income tax. I mean, there are other taxes. We have payroll taxes used for Social Security. There's corporate taxes. But, so much of our revenue is from income tax. And back then, the founders preferred these kind of taxes, tariffs, and excise taxes as well. There was a famous tax on whiskey that was passed, which led to the Whiskey Rebellion. And we moved away from that because people had this sense that those taxes were regressive. They hit poorer people than richer people. And that's a fair criticism of it because, a merchant who has to pay a certain amount, or let's say a poor person that has to pay a tax, let's say a hidden tax on whiskey, that's a bigger percentage of that person's income than, say, like a wealthy landowner, right? And the idea of an income tax was that it would be fairer. The richer would pay their fair share. The reason, though, that they wanted these taxes was because if the tax on an item, like an excise tax on, say, whiskey, was too high, the people automatically would vote with their wallets and not buy that good, right? And so there was actually and what happened if they wouldn't buy that good, then the federal revenue from that would decrease. So there's actually a built-in mechanism there that if the tax was too high, the people would not buy that good, and the federal government wouldn't get that revenue. So it was almost a natural supply and demand mechanism that prevented taxes from getting too high. But once you depart from that, once you depart from those kind of taxes, it's very easy for politicians to raise taxes as high as they want, right? Like on income tax. The highest marginal rate we had was, I believe, 89 to 90, I think it was 91 or 94%, which was under FDR. At one point, at a certain amount that you got over a certain dollar amount, you literally had to give almost 100% of your income over to the government. And that's what happened once you departed from the founders' vision of limited government.
Yeah, that's crazy that the taxes could get that high. But the tariffs were ultimately seen as beneficial, like you said, bipartisan. Most of the cabinet agreed on them, and they ultimately were beneficial to kind of stimulate that revenue that was needed for the government. And then this led into Hamilton's financial plan, which you very comprehensively broke down, and led to the Compromise of 1790, which is something that I find fascinating. One of the most fascinating aspects of Washington's presidency, this kind of backdoor deal between Hamilton and Jefferson and Madison to get his financial plan passed. But Hamilton's financial plan, obviously, he had this whole comprehensive plan. He had the central bank, and he needed the Southern votes to get it passed because a lot of the Southerners and the Democratic Republicans didn't support it because they feared it was too strong of a central government. But Hamilton also recognized that if the capital was moved closer to the South, that he could get those Southern votes. And because the capital at the time was in New York City, it was a temporary capital. They were looking on where to move it to. So they kind of had these 2 points of leverage with the Southerners wanting the capital closer and Hamilton needing those Southern votes for his financial plan. So kind of walk me through how the Compromise of 1790 came about and ultimately what was the deal they made.
Yeah, so the 1790 Compromise was basically over the entire assumption plan. And what happened was that there was a lot of opposition from those states that had paid back their debts from the war. And they held up this plan. And there's this story that on their way to Washington, when Jefferson was going to meet with Washington in the executive residence, and then he saw Hamilton on his way out, and Hamilton looked dejected, and it was one of those, what's wrong? What's wrong, Alex? Oh, well, this is what's wrong, Tommy. And then the two of them plus James Madison met for dinner, and what some historians say is the most important dinner in American history. And they basically worked out a plan in which Jefferson and Madison were not in love with the Assumption Plan, but they saw it as a way to get the capital basically near Virginia, where both men were from. There was this idea that hopefully Virginia could influence the capital that way. And it was something that reportedly later on they saw as a mistake. And I think historically, if you look at the fact that D.C. and Virginia, the fact that Virginia, which used to be the heart of the Confederacy, where Richmond, the capital, was, it used to be a relatively conservative state, but now it's become a purple state, leaning towards blue. That's really the influence of D.C. on Virginia. It's been reversed. But at the time, it was seen as the South basically gets influence over the capital while the North gets its assumption plan through. So that's basically what happened. And I lived in D.C. for many years. I lived there for 14 years. And it's always fun to tell people, when you ask them, why is D.C. the capital? Why is this patch of land here, right here? Why did they choose it? And people get so curious about, oh yeah, why is D.C. the capital? And I tell them, America was the Declaration of Independence was drafted in Philadelphia. The Constitution was drafted in Philadelphia. So why is it not in Philadelphia? Why is it in D.C.? And so then you get into the history, and you see one of the best things about it is that it was the result of a compromise, which is a necessary ingredient of a Republican government, right? You want to call it a republic, democracy, whatever, but in a representative democracy, the only way, the founders created a system in which the only way to get anything done, you need to convince the majority of both houses, sometimes a supermajority, and the president has to sign it into law. And if challenged, the courts will uphold it. So you have a lot of people involved in a law being passed. And the only reason the capital is there isn't because one guy mandated it from heaven and said the capital shall henceforth be. It was literally the people's representatives had to come to a agreement to get it done. And so it's such a human thing, having the capital. Now, the thing is that there was a lot of debate because a lot of states wanted their big city to be the capital, because if you get that capital, as your city becomes the capital, you're the most powerful state in the whole country, right? So New York had the capital for a little bit. Philadelphia was the capital for a little bit. And Philadelphians were not happy when this random space between Virginia and basically this area, what is now D.C., was being carved out of Virginia and Maryland territory. Philadelphians were like, "What the heck? Are we chopped liver? Hello, the Declaration, the Constitution were signed here." So basically, the representatives said, "All right, let's just give Philadelphia the capital for 10 years, and by 1800, hopefully that new capital will be built." So that's the story of American politics. It's compromise. That's how it happened.
Yeah, compromise. And I think that's a good way to put it, what you said earlier, one of the most important dinners in American history, because a very important financial plan came out of it and our nation's capital. But I'd like to pivot now to some of the other issues that Washington had to address while in office. And one of them, which was a very complicated issue at the time, it's easy to look in hindsight now, back in time, and look at slavery as an evil practice, which of course it was. But at the time, it was a very complicated issue for them, and it was very taboo. If you brought it up in Congress, people got really awkward, and they didn't really want to talk about it, and they kind of wanted to kick the can down the road. And Washington himself did own slaves, but he didn't necessarily like the practice or was too fond of it. He eventually did want slavery to be abolished. So was there any action taken towards slavery during his presidency?
Well, yeah, actually, obviously this is a very complicated issue, and there are several things at work here. The first is that the founding fathers, many of them were anti-slavery. I would say that you have a number of the northern states abolishing slavery during this time through gradual emancipation, programs. And what's interesting is that, and Lincoln would say this later, he would point this out, is that in 1787, the Northwest Territories were organized, and slavery was abolished it was banned in those territories. So this kind of shows you a vision of what the founders wanted. And Lincoln argued that the founders essentially wanted slavery to die off, and they wanted it to be restricted where it was. And they feared that if there was an attempt to abolish it too quickly, it would destroy the whole country. It would disrupt the economy. And, first of all, disrupt the economy, but secondly, it would also just lead to so much division politically and maybe ignite a civil war. So the idea was that, and Joseph Ellis has said this, the Pulitzer Prize winning historian, has said literally the choice for the founders was either you could have a country with slavery or you could have no country while trying to get rid of slavery. And I think this is where the contrast with the French Revolution is very apt, because the French Revolution attempted to eliminate all social ills immediately. And what it did was create a tyranny, right? They tried to get rid of all forms of oppression. And in doing so, they tried to get rid of like the entire nobility, and it just became a bloodbath. And so the founders realized that, okay, if you want to create a republic in which we have the consent of as many people as possible, you're going to have to make a compromise with slavery right now, and but set it up to be extinct later on. The people that grew up under slavery, like Washington and Jefferson and Madison, they didn't choose to grow up. They were born into that society, and it was almost unfathomable for anyone to think that, oh, hey, let's just get rid of it one day. But nonetheless, Washington did, during the Revolution, become close to people who opposed slavery: Hamilton, Lafayette, John Lawrence. And when this happened, and he saw a lot of Black Americans fight bravely during the Revolution. And so what you see around 1787, 1788 was Washington talking about slavery. He knows, first of all, he sees it as an inefficient system, right, of labor. People who are not paid have no incentive to give you their best work. But he also looks at it in moral terms because of that influence from the abolitionists. And there's a quote where he says that slavery is it's the only subject of regret in my life, and unavoidable regret. And he wanted to do something to alleviate the suffering of those who were enslaved. And he said he hoped that this would be pleasing to the Creator, right? So he's talking about it in terms of, what's right in terms of religious principles. So he knows that it's wrong morally as well. And he basically, a lot of the founders, they wanted to restrict slavery's growth, i.e., ban it from the new territories, so it could die that natural death. Unfortunately, that's something that would not come to fruition because of the cotton gin being invented, which increased the demand for slave labor. But when Washington does become president, he does sign a law reaffirming the ban of slavery in the Northwest Territories. So that's important to point out. And then, in addition to that, I mean, there's basically a gag order on the slavery issue until I think it was like 1808. There was a 20-year ban on bringing up the slave trade, but as soon as that ban was over, this was after Washington had died, the slave trade was banned. So it was one of those things where they were kind of giving America the space to grow as a nation, and then they banned it immediately. So the founders knew it was evil, and as we know, Washington ends up freeing his slaves, and he actually had plans to rent out his slaves so that they could start earning money, and which kind of gets them out of the slave system. And the thing I always like to point out is that, now, I'm not saying Washington was perfect. There are lots of stories of him trying to reclaim runaway slaves and things like that. So by no means was he perfect. However, I do want to point out that when Washington frees the slaves in his will, he stipulates that the elderly slaves be taken care of for the rest of their lives, and that the young slaves be taught how to read. And if you know anything about the slave system, teaching slaves how to read, and he said he wanted to do this to give them a better future than the one that they had. Teaching slaves how to read would ultimately destroy the slave system, because if there's anything that destroys any kind of oppressive system, it's educating people. And if you look at a figure like Frederick Douglass, who rose from being a slave to being educated to being one of the great Americans of all time, that really laid the seeds for eventual destruction of the slave system. So he was on board with that, and he called for a gradual emancipation scheme, that he wanted the Union preserved. He didn't want it destroyed over the issue of slavery, because then there'd be freedom for nobody. But it was an issue he really came around on.
Yeah, when it comes to Washington, I think he definitely, I mean, I know he had slaves, he wasn't perfect, but he did emancipate them in his will, and like you said, he wanted to educate them and take care of them. So I think he definitely wanted to handle the issue of slavery. But ultimately, I think it's one of our founding generation's biggest and one of their only blunders was that slavery was such a taboo subject, and they just wanted to kick the can down the road instead of just tackling the issue, because it ultimately would be one of the reasons for the Civil War, 80 years later, 90 years later. So I do think that it was sort of a blunder of that revolutionary era. But when it came to Washington, I do think he had, like you said, he had that moral obligation, and he felt the religious principles of it, and talked about he wanted to do good by his creator.
I would say I think it's important to note that when you have a republic, you have to convince a lot of people, right? You have to convince a lot of people to go along with what you want. And that's very hard. I mean, try convincing one person. Like, have you ever had a friend that you've had debates with? It's really hard, right? It's almost impossible. So convincing the whole country to get rid of something in which the economy is completely intertwined with is very difficult, the Southern economy specifically. What I think is that there were definitely founders in, let's say, the Deep South that were basically said, don't touch slavery at all, right? And what those people believed, I think you could make an argument that some of them wanted slavery to die over time, and maybe some of them said, okay, well, look, this is just the way it is, right? But I think once you had enough of those founders, the rest of the founders, and I would say the majority of the founders, I don't think the rest of them really had a choice, because the rest of them knew that in this world, we need a union to counter all of the European empires, right? And the only way you could have that union is to compromise with people that own slaves, right? So my personal view is that the founding fathers, the vast majority of founding fathers understood that slaves were people and that they were entitled to the same rights that God had given them, but they felt like those could only be realized over time, right? In fact, there are writings of the time. Washington had one of his family members. They wrote about how slaves are not inherently inferior, but it was their condition, the fact that slavery prevented them from having an education and owning territory, owning land, and all that stuff. And so they actually would compare the black slaves to white peasants during the medieval times, right? They knew, many of them knew it wasn't their condition. It wasn't it wasn't that they were inherently inferior. It was because of the fact that it was their condition. So now, not everyone believed that. There are other people at the time that said that, yeah, blacks are inherently inferior to whites. But many of them, especially in Washington's circle, did not believe that. They believed that blacks were equal to whites in moral worth. But the problem is that when you have a small percentage of people that are basically they basically have held the government hostage, and they said, we're not going to join your union unless you look the other way on slavery, then to me, it's not the founders as a whole. It's that group of people that are forcing that choice on everybody. So I don't think it's fair to blame, say, John Adams, who was, or Alexander Hamilton, who was strongly anti-slavery. And had they had their way, they would have had slavery abolished in a wise, gradual way, right? But so I personally don't think it's fair to lump all the founders that way. I think that the founders that wanted to get rid of slavery had the choice between you can have a country and compromise with slavery for a few decades, or you could try to get rid of it now and there would be no country at all. That's the choice they had. And I think Washington and Adams and Hamilton made the best choice for the country. If you're going to pin the blame on anyone, I think it's the ones who forced that choice on everyone else.
No, yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that for sure. I definitely don't want to throw the blame on the abolitionists of the time, especially, Hamilton and Adams, because they were definitely advocating for the abolition. And it was such a complicated issue at the time because, like you said, these people were born into this society. It was so integrated in society, and just absolutely abolishing it outright in that moment probably could have destroyed the economy and the infrastructure and the way that the country operated. So a natural death probably was the right path, but it still did ultimately lead to a civil war. So there was, on some part, the people, like you said, the people who forced this issue on and forced that choice, it would be their fault. But it ultimately did lead to a civil war. So there was some failure there in the negotiations and the compromises that did lead to a civil war. But I want to pivot to another issue at the time, and that was I called it the border crisis at the beginning of the episode, but the conflict with the Native Americans on the western border of the nation at the time, which was basically around the Mississippi River. And there was huge conflict with, white settlers encroaching on Native American territory and Native American conflicts and uprisings. And obviously, this would later lead to another dark stain in American history with the Indian removal policy. But at the time, it was still early on. So what was Washington's take on the conflict with the Native Americans?
Yeah, it's interesting because, Washington, he worked with Native Americans since his childhood, really. Since his youth. You had tribes that were all over the United States at the time. And as soon as, when Washington is in his 20s, he gets his first assignment to be an envoy from the British to the French in the Ohio. And already then he's working with Native Americans, gathering allies against the French. And the French have allies against the British. So Native Americans are kind of on both sides of that issue. And during that time, they figure prominently in the conflict in the American Revolution. And there was this big hunger for land during that time. You know, the colonists, including Washington himself, they basically see land as a ticket to status. And at the same time, though, there's this constant skirmishes going on between Native Americans and white settlers. And during the American Revolution, you know, Native Americans fight on the side of the Americans and they fight on the side of the British. But it's difficult because Native Americans don't have the same view of land that that whites have. You know, whites come from this idea going back to the English common law. And land ownership was something that was there were all these legal concepts behind it. There was so much history behind it, and that's how Europeans operated, and that's how the American colonists operated. Was that you had titles to land. So much of the landowners in the colonies, they were granted that land from the British Crown. That includes Washington's own family, his ancestors. Native Americans didn't really have that kind of culture. They didn't have the established legal infrastructure by and large. Oftentimes tribes would use land and then leave it after using it. They would use land and then another tribe would want it and fight it, and Native Americans were pushing each other off of land all the time. So you had two cultures that had very different views of land. And when Washington becomes president, he essentially he has the view that he has during the war that you want peace. War is costly, whether it's with the British or Native Americans. So he wants peace on the borders. But whenever there are attacks, whenever settlers and Native Americans fight each other, the situation has to be pacified. And that's essentially what happened. Washington had no hesitation to send, whenever Native Americans would attack white settlers, he had no hesitation to send a force to pacify Native Americans and make a statement. So that did happen. And it resulted ultimately in the defeat of the Native Americans in the Northwest in the frontier of the United States. At the same time, Washington in 1790, his second year as president, signed a treaty with Native Americans, and he hoped it was the Treaty of New York, and it was basically with the Creek and Seminole Native Americans up in the Northeast, and he hoped that this would set a precedent that essentially would allow the United States and Native Americans to live peacefully. The United States would recognize land that belonged to Native Americans. And he hoped that this would be a viable solution. And in addition to that, he encouraged Native Americans, he encouraged Christian missionaries to reach out to them. And he also encouraged them to take up more agricultural type rather than the hunter-gatherer type lifestyle where they could basically become landowners themselves. And eventually they would integrate into the United States. But the problem is that there was no way to enforce it because you have thousands, tens of thousands, eventually millions of Americans moving out west, and no matter what the federal government passed, and at the same time there was a fear of a standing army, so there's very little army to speak of that couldn't enforce the law, and white settlers would just push into Native American lands. The two would fight, it would be ugly, and more Native Americans would be pushed farther westward, culminating in the 1830s with the Trail of Tears, Andrew Jackson basically pushing them even farther west. So it was one of those things that it was a tragedy, and I think Washington did try to have a peaceful solution to it, but unfortunately it was just something that the pace of history prevented it from actually happening. I mean, it's one of those things. It's like if England would have passed a law saying that no whites could ever travel to the New World, it would have happened anyways. I mean, a lot of people traveled to the New World to get away from the laws. So it's one of those things where you could say this and that and it could have done better or whatever, but I have a feeling that if Washington did everything right, this all would have still happened. It was the trend of history, and it was honestly the trend that was happening among Native Americans themselves. If you study the Black Hills, the Cheyenne were the Lakota Sioux were there. They pushed out the Cheyenne, and the Cheyenne pushed out the people that were there before that. I mean, that was the trend of history that was already happening.
Yeah, I would definitely have to agree. It was definitely a recipe for trouble and a recipe for tragedy because, like you said, you don't have an army to enforce these policies. You have a new nation with a thirst for land and growth that's unquenchable, eventually just going all the way to the Pacific. You have thousands of different Native American tribes who are at war with each other, at war with, the white Americans, constantly conflicts. How are you going to negotiate and deal with all of these different tribes and try to negotiate treaties with all of them when they all have different motives in mind and different agendas? So it's a very difficult issue to tackle, and I think you said it nicely where even if Washington did everything right, it's still history would have trended in that direction anyway. But one of Washington's most infamous moments in his entire history was his infamous farewell address, where he stepped down, unprecedented, stepped down from power after 2 terms, giving up his power because everyone expected him to serve for life. So he gives up his power after 2 terms and delivers this beautiful farewell address, which Hamilton helped him write. But what did he ultimately say in his farewell address?
Yeah, that's a great question. People used to rank the farewell address up there with the Constitution and the Declaration as like the absolute, the holy trinity of American political philosophy. Now it's kind of forgotten. It's interesting. I read a comparison that the Gettysburg Address has kind of supplanted the farewell address as the most famous presidential speech. And it's kind of like they compare if the Gettysburg Address is the New Testament, the farewell address is the Old Testament. It's longer. It's not as poetic. I mean, there's a lot of great poetry in the Old Testament, by the way. But anyways, the farewell address is basically Washington's. This is how you get on without me. America has existed depending on me, and you can't do that for the rest. I mean, it's a republic, it's ruled by the people, not ruled by George Washington. So I'm leaving. Here's how to do it. And essentially, there are really 2 pillars to it. The first is that he believes strongly that there were transcendent morals that every country had to respect. Everyone in those countries had to respect. So he literally says in it that of all the dispositions that lead to political prosperity, so he's saying of all the things that lead to the country thriving, religion and morality are indispensable supports. Basically saying that the people need to be infused with religious belief. And it's kind of like what Adams said. John Adams said that the Constitution only works for a moral and religious people. And he says very clearly that let us with caution indulge the idea that morality, that you can have morality without religion. So he's basically saying you can't have, you should not be, if you want the country to survive, you should not be hostile to people having religious faith and applying those beliefs in their political beliefs. So, someone like Martin Luther King is revered by millions of Americans, but let's not forget that the core of his beliefs in fighting for civil rights was his beliefs as a Christian. He was a Baptist preacher, and those were the core of his beliefs. So if you denigrate that, you actually hurt the prosperity of the country. That's what Washington's saying. The second thing he's saying is that, look, I know when you have a republic based on equality, you're going to be all wrapped up in the ideals of it. Equality, freedom, opportunity. But don't forget that this is a fallen world, and this country has real enemies, external and internal. And that a republic isn't this high-minded pie-in-the-sky thing. It isn't this. It's recognizing that human nature is fallen, and there's a line in it where he says that the love of liberty is interwoven with every ligament of your heart. So our hearts, Americans in their hearts love freedom. But it also says there that love of power is also in the human heart as well. So in my opinion, this is kind of the Christian idea that man is made in God's image. So he is worthy of rights and equality, but he's also fallen, and he also craves power. And so you need to have a clear-minded idea of that, and that's where he felt the French Revolution failed, is that it was utopianist. It tried to create this new country based, that man could be perfected. That's in Washington's view. No, that's not true. Man cannot be perfected on his own efforts. Man inherently wants power, and so that's why he called for checks and balances. He said, and that's why he said that the people in power need to respect the boundaries placed by the Constitution, because humanity inherently wants more power. So I think the religious morality and the realism piece are the two biggest things that are in that farewell address. And unfortunately, most Americans have forgotten it. It's a bit lengthy. It takes a while to read. School children used to read it, but it has wonderful warnings about that. It basically says, look, the ideals of equality are great, but you only realize them if you understand what a dangerous world this is, that we have people in this country that want power, and we have foreign leaders who want to use us and manipulate us. And that's why he wanted a foreign policy where we avoided those conflicts for the time being, so that we wouldn't be manipulated by power-hungry empires. And internally, he wanted a strong rule of law to prevent, political factions from getting too much power. That's why he warned us against political parties, because he said that those parties feed into our ambitions.
Yeah, absolutely. Neutrality and political parties were another couple things that he definitely warned against. And that was the position that he took ultimately with the French Revolution, this idea of neutrality. But that's a good point you make, that he was warning against, foreign officials wanting to take advantage of the fledgling nation, and he kind of didn't want to get meddled in those affairs, and he obviously saw all the negative aspects of the political parties, with all the infighting he had with the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans with the political parties. But ultimately those warnings would go unheard, especially if you look at today's political landscape with the division of the political parties we have now. But that ultimately wraps up Washington's presidency with his, beautiful farewell address. Richard, I want to thank you so much for coming on. Your podcast is going to be linked in the description below, so you guys go check that out. And Richard, thank you for coming on.
Thank you. Great to be here.